She never spoke a word, but when a cowboy stood beside her, the whole town was forced to listen. What they tried to bury with silence came roaring back in front of the gallows. And by the end, the girl they called Voiceless changed everything. A shocking revelation comes next. But before we uncover the truth that shook the entire frontier, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss more stories like this, where one decision can change everything. She sat in the shadows behind the saloon, back pressed against the splintered boards, her knees drawn to her chest like she was trying to disappear into herself. The dust clung to her skin, streaked with blood and sweat, and her eyes, wide, black, and still, held the kind of silence that screamed louder than any voice. They called her the Mute Girl because names had power, and no one in Ash Hollow wanted to give her any. The barkeep kicked over a bucket in her direction once, muttering that she was bad luck. The preacher crossed the street when he saw her, as if her silence carried sin. Children were told not to stare. She had no shoes, no parents, no language the town could understand or wanted to. Some said she came down from the old woods near the ridge, where fire once cleared out a village nobody dared to mention. Others whispered that she was a curse left behind by savages who didn't know when to stay dead. But no one asked her. No one tried. She just showed up one morning after a storm, sitting in the dirt like she'd been there all along, with eyes that saw everything and lips that gave nothing back. Bruises bloomed across her arms, fresh and deliberate. But when Doc Temple offered her a hand, she flinched so violently that even he stepped back. The sheriff said to leave her be. She'll wander off or wither, one or the other. But she didn't. She stayed. Day after day, crouched in that same alley, watching a town built on stolen land pretend it had no ghosts. And that's where Jack Corbin first saw her. Silent, still, and forgotten by everyone but the wind. He didn't say a word. Just looked at her, tipped his hat, and kept walking. But something about her eyes followed him. Jack Corbin wasn't the kind of man to linger. He rode light, spoke less, and carried his past like a saddlebag he never unpacked. When he rode into Ash Hollow that morning, the sun barely up and the air already dry with judgment, he was looking for nothing more than coffee beans and a new horseshoe. But fate don't wait for convenient hours. He tied his gelding outside the general store, dusted off his coat, and heard the noise before he saw it. Mocking laughter, boots scuffling on hardpan, and the sharp thud of someone falling against the alley wall. Around the corner, 3 local boys barely old enough to shave had cornered the girl, the mute one, poking at her with sticks, calling her names too rotten to repeat. "Hey, little squaw," one of them hissed. "You think you're special 'cause you don't talk?" Jack didn't say anything. He just stepped into view like a shadow come to collect. His boots hit the ground like distant thunder, and when the boys turned, they froze. Not because of his size or his gun, but because of the weight in his eyes. That quiet, measured stare that said, "Make one more move, and you'll be tasting your teeth." "Town got a law against cowards now?" Jack asked, voice low and dry as mesquite bark. One boy mumbled something about just teasing, but Jack stepped closer, slow and deliberate, and they scattered like crows from a carcass. Luma didn't move. She didn't flinch, just stared at him like he was the first thing in weeks that hadn't tried to break her. Jack tipped his hat. Didn't look like much fun. She said nothing, of course, but her hand, resting on the ground, curled into a fist. It was the smallest motion, But it was the first sign of fight he'd seen in that town all morning. Ash Hollow had the kind of silence that didn't come from peace. It came from secrets packed into corners, like gunpowder waiting on a spark. Sheriff Albee ran the town like a ledger, cold and impersonal, always weighing who owed what and who was expendable. Reverend Merriweather preached forgiveness on Sundays, then spat tobacco and suspicion by Monday morning. And Harold Crane, the banker, sat in his polished office like a spider in the center of a gold-threaded web, keeping ledgers no one else saw. They didn't break bread together, didn't drink from the same bottle. But when it came to the mute girl, their interests aligned like buzzards, circling the same carcass. Luma, barely more than a shadow with skin, had stumbled into something without knowing it, something deep, buried, and worth killing to keep hidden. They didn't need her to talk. They feared what she might remember, or worse, what someone like Jack Corbin might figure out with a little time and too many questions. Sheriff Albee leaned on the shopkeepers, whispering that the girl was diseased. Reverend Merriweather told the flock she was of troubled blood, cursed by God, maybe even marked by spirits. And Crane? He just smiled, soft and slow, as he bought up land on the edge of town, land that once belonged to people who vanished without a trace. The town had built its future on forgetting. Luma was the ember they couldn't stomp out. She lingered like the scent of smoke after a fire, reminding everyone of something they'd rather keep buried. But Jack had seen enough of towns like this to know that when all the important men are scared of a child, it ain't the child that's dangerous. It's the truth she carries. And Ash Hollow's truth was about to wake up. That night, under a sky bruised purple with desert twilight, Jack sat across the campfire from Luma just outside town limits, watching the girl cradle her tin cup like it was the last warm thing in her world. She hadn't spoken a word, but her silence said more than 100 voices ever could. Her eyes were sharp, not dull. She noticed things, tracked movement like a hawk. And when she reached to stoke the fire with a charred stick, the edge of her sleeve slipped just enough for Jack to catch a glimpse of ink. Not the kind barkeeps got in drunken fits, or cowboys scrawled for luck, but a precise, sacred mark, curved like wind over stone, and notched with lines that only the oldest maps remembered. Jack leaned closer, not to frighten her, but to be sure. "That's a washti," he said softly. Luma froze. Her eyes darted to his, and for the first time, there was fear in them, not of him, but of what he saw. A washti wasn't supposed to exist anymore. 10 years ago, it burned. The official word had been accident, a blaze blamed on lightning and bad timing. But those who'd ridden far and paid attention knew better. It had been erased. The whole settlement, its people, its culture, even its name, had been scraped clean from the history books like it never mattered. The survivors? They were ghosts, hunted or forgotten. And now here was one, hiding behind kindling and ash, with the mark of her ancestors etched into her skin like defiance made permanent. Jack didn't ask how she'd survived. He didn't ask what she remembered. He just looked back at town, at the sheriff, the preacher, the banker, and finally understood why they all wanted her gone. Because Luma wasn't a stray child. She was a living receipt of sins they'd thought they'd burned. The more Jack wandered Ash Hollow with boots dusty from questions, the more the town seemed to close in around itself like a rattler coiled in guilt. Folks who'd been chatty one day clammed up the next. Shopkeepers lowered their shades when he passed, Even the barkeep, who'd once offered him coffee without charge, now poured it slow and sour, avoiding eye contact. Jack wasn't new to this rhythm. He'd seen it before in mining towns, built on stolen claims, and settlements propped up by blood and silence. The real story always lived in the corners. And it was there he found it. A stack of old land deeds half buried in the records room at the back of the courthouse, hidden behind names no longer on tombstones. Luma's last name, etched in delicate penmanship, tied to a wide stretch of valley where the new railway now carved through the land like a scar. The same land being surveyed by men in suits with smiles too wide and maps too clean. Her people had held it for generations, back when the Awashti still sang to the wind and planted stories in the soil. But after the fire, the land reverted to the county, sold cheap, quick, and quiet. Jack didn't need the rest spelled out. Her silence, the bruises, the boys who'd cornered her in the alley, they weren't random cruelty. They were fear. The kind born when someone survives what was meant to be wiped away. Luma wasn't cursed. She was protected by her own stillness, holding truth like a glass jar that hadn't cracked. Yet. And the town knew it. That's why the sheriff looked the other way. Why the preacher spread stories. Why the banker kept offering to relocate the girl to some far-off mission school. Because the land beneath Ash Hollow didn't belong to them. It never had. And the girl who couldn't speak was the only one left who could prove it. The note was folded neatly, pressed beneath Jack's coffee tin like a whisper that refused to stay buried. He hadn't heard anyone come in, hadn't seen a shadow pass under his door. But the handwriting was elegant, the kind that spoke of schooling and restraint, of letters once sent in better days. The message read, "She saw what they did. That's why they want her gone." Just that, no name, no signature, no flourish. Jack pocketed it and stepped into the pale dawn, the dust in the street still clinging to the edges of sleep. He retraced the day in his mind until he remembered the woman in the window. Third floor of the old mercantile, always watching, her face half swallowed by lace curtains. Folks said she hadn't left her apartment since the fire at the schoolhouse a decade ago. A widow, or a madwoman, or both. Jack paid her a visit, knocking soft, polite, like one does at the edge of a grave. She didn't open the door, but she spoke through it, voice brittle with memory. Said she'd once been a teacher, back when Luma's people still lived freely. Said the fire didn't start in the kitchen like they claimed. Said she'd seen men in blue uniforms carrying torches and laughing. Said the sheriff had told her to keep quiet, or she'd end up mistaken for kindling, too. She hadn't spoken of it in years. Not until she saw Luma. "That child carries too much truth," the woman murmured. "Truth makes dangerous cargo, in a place built on lies." Jack didn't need more. The pieces were falling like timber in a storm. Luma hadn't just survived. She remembered. Maybe not with words, but in the way she looked at the preacher, or shrank when the banker passed, or clenched her fists when the church bell rang. She didn't need to speak. The town's fear did it for her. The old schoolhouse sat crooked on the edge of Ash Hollow, half swallowed by weeds and memory, its bell long rusted into silence. Jack found the teacher, Mr. Ellison, 2 towns over, working as a gravedigger in a cemetery that didn't ask questions. His back was bent, but his eyes were sharp, like someone who'd learned to carry the weight of names never spoken aloud. He didn't flinch when Jack mentioned Luma. Just nodded slow, like he'd been waiting for the name to return to him. Years ago, he said, her mother, Naya, came to him bruised, barefoot, carrying a baby and a blood-stained ledger wrapped in cloth. She said the town had stolen something that couldn't be replaced. Not just land, but legacy. She was going to speak out. Ellison offered her the storeroom in the school's basement, just until she could find a lawyer, or a relative, or courage enough to face the town's leaders head-on. But 3 nights later, she vanished. No signs of struggle, no body, just a red scarf caught in the wind, tied to the schoolhouse gate like a warning. He went to the sheriff, got told it was none of his concern. Went to the preacher, got told it was God's justice. The banker didn't even pretend to listen. And when he tried to tell the children's parents what had happened, angry letters arrived at his door. His contract wasn't renewed the following spring. This town burns whatever it can't bury, Ellison said, staring out over the rows of crooked headstones. But the problem with ghosts is they don't stay quiet forever. Jack left the graveyard with a sense that something had cracked open. Luma's silence wasn't an accident, or even a condition. It was inherited, a wall built by fear and kept standing by ashes. But now, for the first time in years, someone was ready to knock. The pews were packed tighter than a cattle car that morning, hymns rising like smoke to the rafters. But Jack wasn't there to sing. He sat halfway back, hat in hand, eyes locked on the preacher, Reverend Harlan Pike, a man with polished boots and a voice like sugar poured over gravel. Jack waited through the sermon, watched as Pike spoke of forgiveness and order, of knowing one's place and the dangers of rebellion. But it was in the quiet after the service, beneath the low hum of post-sermon chatter and whispered gossip, that Jack made his move. He caught the preacher by the steps, offered a handshake with one hand, and slid a folded document from his coat with the other. A copy of the deed transfer that bore Pike's signature, dated just days after the settlement fire that erased Luma's family from the map. Pike's smile faltered. His eyes, usually bright and performative, narrowed like a man who'd been caught reaching in the wrong pocket. That land was abandoned, he said, voice low but trembling. Jack didn't flinch. So was she. The tension curled between them like barbed wire. Jack saw it then, the preacher's hand twitch, not toward a weapon, but toward his collar, as if the noose he helped tie years ago had suddenly tightened around his own neck. Others passed by, nodding politely, none hearing the truth boiling beneath the stained glass pleasantries. Jack leaned closer, whispering just loud enough for Pike's ears alone. If God's watching, Reverend, he's not smiling. Pike tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. He told Jack to be careful who he accused, especially in God's house. Jack tipped his hat, turned away, and left the church. Its golden light now looking more like firelight, reflected off old lies. The first stone had been thrown, not through a window, but through the quiet immunity of men who'd built altars atop other people's graves. And the echo of that stone was just beginning to stir. The smell hit first, sharp, bitter, unmistakably wrong, and then came Luma's hands, clawing at Jack's coat, her wide eyes frantic in the dark. He didn't need words. The stable was lit from within like a lantern tipped sideways, flames licking through dry hay, and timber beams like a snake through grass. They'd stacked crates at the door, while the two slept in the loft, the smoke already curling up like ghost fingers through the cracks. Jack grabbed her hand, kicked the window out with one boot, and shoved her down into the cold, hard dirt below. He followed a second later, rolling through sparks and hitting the ground just as the roof gave in with a crash that cracked the sky open. Townsfolk gathered as the fire climbed into the stars, faces pale in the glow, murmuring accusations under breath. It wasn't the fire that terrified them. It was who had escaped it. Jack stood with soot on his face and ash in his mouth, his arm shielding the girl they'd all tried to forget. No one offered help. No one spoke her name. The sheriff didn't even come. Just a few muttered warnings, a couple of men loosening their belts near the saloon, and one voice whispering, they should have stayed in the smoke. Jack saw it plain now. The town had chosen silence over truth, history over justice, and fear over decency. And now, with Luma by his side, he was marked, not just as a stranger, but as a threat. Ash Hollow didn't want answers. It wanted quiet. But the fire hadn't silenced anything. It had ignited something older, buried deep, something that would rise again in heat and truth and fury. The stable was gone. But the reckoning had only just begun. The morning came hot and heavy with tension, the kind that clung to the skin like swamp air before a storm. They dragged Luma out in shackles, her bare feet black with soot, and sat her on a rickety chair on the boardwalk outside the general store, because Ash Hollow didn't believe in courtrooms, only in spectacle. The sheriff stood tall with a tin star polished to a blinding shine, reading off a list of charges that smelled more like fear than law. Arson, theft, trespassing, conspiracy. The preacher nodded solemnly. The banker folded his arms, and the townsfolk leaned in, not to judge, but to feed off the drama like buzzards around a dying steer. Jack pushed through the crowd, hat low, boots caked in ash, his voice a slow drawl cutting through the silence like a blade. "You think she lit that fire from inside the stable you locked her in?" he asked. And when no one answered, he dropped the charred remains of a kerosene canister at the sheriff's feet, marked with church inventory stamps. Gasps rippled. Some stepped back. The preacher's mouth tightened. Jack held up a crumpled ledger, rescued from a hidden loft inside the burned stable. "And here's proof of the land theft, the forged signatures, and the payments made in hush money." He looked straight at the banker, whose face drained whiter than bone. Luma didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence became a roar as Jack's voice rose in defense, exposing each layer of corruption like peeling bark from a poisoned tree. One by one, townsfolk began to avert their gaze, shame gnawing at whatever conscience hadn't yet rotted. The trial collapsed in on itself, not with a bang, but with the quiet horror of a town realizing it had backed the wrong truth for far too long. The sheriff tried to speak. Jack didn't let him. "You don't get to sentence anyone," he said. "Not after what you let burn." And with that, the boardwalk wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a reckoning. With the crowd stunned into silence and the sun scorching down on the wooden planks of Ash Hollow, Jack stepped forward, not with rage, but with the calm fury of a man who's seen too much silence used as a weapon. Luma stood beside him, eyes wide, chin high, trembling but unbroken. Jack spoke not just for her, but through her, each word a hammer blow against the lies that had choked this town for over a decade. He held up the forged land deeds, the school teacher's written testimony, the charred page from the church ledger, and read them aloud as if he were reciting gospel. They stole her land, erased her family, and blamed her for the fire they lit, he said, turning his gaze to the banker, the preacher, the sheriff, all now exposed under a sun that no longer offered them the comfort of shadows. He told the story of her mother, how she vanished after seeking justice. He told them about the preacher's holy silence, the banker's greed, and the sheriff's cowardice, wrapped in a badge. But then he did something no one expected. He looked to Luma, gently held her hand, and said, "You don't need a voice to speak. You've survived every lie they threw at you, and now the truth's louder than anything they ever built." And somehow, in that moment, she smiled, a soft, pained, defiant smile. The kind that said she hadn't been broken, just buried, and someone had finally dug deep enough to find her again. The crowd shifted uneasily, some crying, some ashamed, others too proud to admit they'd been part of the hush. But none could look away. Because that day, in the blistering heat, on a crooked boardwalk built on stolen ground, the voice they'd tried to erase echoed louder than thunder, and it didn't need words to be heard. The preacher's hand trembled as he drew the pistol from beneath his robe, his eyes wild with the desperation of a man whose lies were unraveling by the second. Jack didn't flinch. He stood tall, defiant, daring him to pull the trigger in front of God and the crowd that once hung on every word from that pulpit. But it wasn't Jack who moved. It was Luma. Silent, battered, and ghost-like no more, she stepped forward with the grace of someone who'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. Her hand rose, not timid, not unsure, and seized the preacher's wrist mid-air. The crowd gasped. The gun wavered. And in that still second, every eye saw her not as a burden or a curse or a stain on the town's pride, but as a girl who had survived every cruel silence and now chose to break it with the strength of her own hands. Her grip wasn't violent, but it was unshakable, the kind that said, "Not this time, not anymore." The preacher's knees buckled, his mask cracked, and the pistol slipped from his fingers with a soft clatter that rang louder than any sermon he'd ever given. Whispers turned to murmurs, then to outright cries of shame and disbelief. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men took off their hats. And Luma, her eyes bright with tears that refused to fall, stood taller than she ever had before. Jack placed a steady hand on her shoulder, not as a protector, but as a partner. Because in that moment, it wasn't the cowboy or the crowd that saved the day. It was the girl with no voice who spoke the loudest by simply refusing to be pushed down one more inch. Jack reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, dust-worn parchment. Its corners frayed and edges blackened by time, but unmistakably official. The original deed, pulled from the rotting floorboards of the old schoolhouse where the past had been buried alongside broken chalk and forgotten promises. He held it high for the crowd to see, the wax seal still clinging to the bottom like a final gasp of dignity. "This," he said, voice steady, "is what they tried to erase." Murmurs rippled through the townsfolk as the sheriff's jaw clenched and the banker paled, his hand twitching toward a pocket watch that suddenly felt more like a noose than an heirloom. Jack unfolded the document fully and read aloud the name scrawled across it in rough, proud strokes. Misua, Luma's grandfather. The preacher staggered back a step, eyes wide with something between disbelief and dawning horror. The ink hadn't faded. The signatures were real. The land the railroad now claimed, the land that had been cleared in fire and silence, was never theirs to claim. It belonged to the family they'd hunted, into shadows and pretended to forget. Luma stood beside Jack, shoulders square, chin lifted, her silence no longer mistaken for ignorance, but understood now as the restraint of someone who could have shattered them all if only they'd listened. A woman in the crowd, once a friend of her mother's, pressed her hand over her mouth and wept openly. The wind kicked up dust between boots and planks, as if the town itself was bracing for what came next. Jack handed the deed to the judge, one of the few men in Ash Hollow with enough backbone to act, and said, "This town can keep pretending, or it can start making things right. But either way, the truth is no longer theirs to bury." It started with a single woman, Mabel Dunn, once the banker's housekeeper, stepping from the crowd and saying, "I remember the girl's mother. She never lied." Then came the blacksmith, who put down his hammer and stood by the gallows post, daring the sheriff to argue with calloused fists and a heart full of unfinished regrets. One by one, the people of Ash Hollow, the same folks who had turned blind eyes and muttered excuses for years, began to speak, their silence cracking like ice under spring thaw. They remembered the fire that claimed Luma's village, how the smoke rose just as the railroad plans were inked, how the preacher called it providence. But now, faced with the truth inked on parchment and burning in Jack's voice, they saw that their silence had been complicity, dressed in Sunday clothes. The preacher tried to shout them down, calling it blasphemy, waving his Bible like a shield. But no one stepped between him and the truth this time. The sheriff reached for his badge as if it still meant order, but it slipped from his hand and clattered on the boardwalk, a hollow sound that echoed too loud. They were escorted out, not by force of law, but by the weight of a community rediscovering its backbone. Luma watched it all from the saloon steps, her eyes steady, her posture unshaken. The same boys who once kicked dirt at her feet now couldn't meet her gaze. As dusk settled and the air cooled, the same church bell that had tolled warnings and hangings now rang with something new, a beginning. Jack stood beside her, not as a savior, but as a witness. And the town, for once, stood with them. Not out of guilt, not out of fear, but because truth, when spoken loud enough, makes cowards run, and good men remember who they were meant to be. Luma never uttered a word, not through the fire, the trial, or the reckoning, but somehow the silence she carried now rang louder than the preacher's old sermons. Ash Hollow changed, not overnight, but enough. The land that once soaked up blood and lies now bore the foundation of something better. A one-room schoolhouse with windows wide to the wind, and lessons written in 2 languages, hers and theirs. Children with moccasins and English names walked side by side through its doors, carrying slates and stories, their futures no longer bound by the silence of fear. The deed was hers now, legal and public, but more importantly, it was earned through courage, through standing tall when others bowed to injustice. Jack Corbin left at sunrise with nothing but his saddlebag and the dust behind him, not waiting for applause or gratitude. He never did. Some said he rode north, others west, but wherever his trail led, the name Luma lingered like a campfire tale told in towns too used to forgetting. She'd never spoken, and yet she'd torn down the kind of cruelty that speaks in locked doors and forged documents. Justice, Jack realized, didn't always ride in with 6 shooters blazing. It sometimes sat quietly beside you in a church pew, or grabbed a crooked hand in midair. And when it came, it didn't ask permission or wait for applause. It just stayed. Long after the last echo of boots had faded and the mob had scattered, it stayed. Luma stood on her own land now, a girl who never needed to raise her voice to be heard. Only her presence, her truth, and the courage to be unmovable. And that, in the end, was louder than anything words could ever say.